So I'm going to talk about three books that I'm reading right now. These are all very different kinds of books. These are new books that I'm reading right now. In addition to some of the books that I have mentioned before that I just haven't finished yet. I have a bad habit of reading many books at the same time. But anyway, so this first one is C.G. Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflection. C.G. Jung, or Carl Gustav Jung, was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalysis. He's the person who kind of invented the field of analytic psychology, and he was supposed to be at some point the successor of Freud. Freud wanted him to be his successor, but then Jung didn't necessarily agree with most of Freud's teachings, especially those in which he kind of resolves a lot of issues into the field of sexuality, which Carl Jung was not necessarily someone who didn't believe that that was the case. He had different theories and stuff. And this book in particular is not about his actual works, although those works are kind of talked about once in a while, and this is not necessarily about the archetype theory. This is his autobiography. It's an autobiography of sorts. He writes some about parts of it, and some bits of it are written by this other girl who, this woman Aniela Jaffe, who interviewed him on and off towards the end of his life. So he was around 80 or something, 82, 83, when he was recollecting on his memories and his past and his childhood, and he talks about a lot of it in the book. I'm like halfway through it, and it's very, very fascinating, I think, to just peek into the mind of such a fascinating individual. And this is actually one of the reasons why I was reading more about Carl Jung, and I was very fascinated about psychology and psychiatry and this idea of dreams and what dreams represent and what dreams seem to, because there's not a lot of scientific knowledge on what dreams actually are, because a lot of the reasons why Carl Jung and Freud, for example, are kind of maligned in the critical or in the academic spheres as of today is partly because a lot of their theories and ways of putting apart their knowledge, a lot of their things cannot really be, what's the term for it? It cannot really be assessed or proven through a scientific method of sorts. So it's kind of moot in the perspective of science. And in the book, he talks about this thing where at a certain point he realized, and he acknowledges this, he realized that he wasn't, writing about science. He wasn't thinking about science. At some point he was considering whether it was art. Was it art or was it science? And he realized at some point it was neither of those two things. It's a very fascinating book, just in order to have a peek into the mind of someone who is such a genius, I think. And the more I read about him, the more I realize he seems kind of like a mystic of sorts, which I find very fascinating. I'm reading William S. Burroughs' Junkie. Junkie is his first novel. William S. Burroughs is one of the beat novelists, and I think this book came out in the 50s, I think. And William S. Burroughs, he was friends with Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, but Burroughs was one of the ones who wrote later in his life. He was not young when he was writing Junkie, but in Junkie he was looking back on his own life, and from what I understand, it's kind of like it's partly autobiographical, and it is set in the New York of the 40s, and especially the Times Square scene, the drug scene. Not necessarily Times Square scene, but it's a scene in New York where everyone was really the underground of the drug scene, where people were trying to get morphine from doctors, and these drug users, and it's very fascinating to look into New York right now. When you think of New York, I think many people think of it as this Times Square. All the things are happening there. It's all entertainment. It's all Broadway. But back then, Times Square was really the seedy place where people were all. Not that it isn't seedy anymore. I was in New York for a couple of years, but it was much more of a no-holds-barred kind of place, and it's very fascinating to have a peek into what kind of life it would have been. It was like when you were in the 40s in New York, being part of this big drug culture, where not only were psychedelics slowly coming into the field, into play, but also cocaine and heroin and all sorts of morphine again, and all these different kinds of drugs, marijuana, weed. It is a very fascinating book, and I'm I just started the book, but it's very fascinating. So I have this Carl Jung book, nonfiction, mostly autobiographical book. This is another, I guess, autobiographical book, sort of, but not, he fictionalizes, of course, parts of his life. The names are different. And the last book that I'm going to talk about is Arthur Schopenhauer's Essays and Aphorisms, which is like a Penguin Classics book. It's Arthur Schopenhauer was those who are unfamiliar with him, he is a famous philosopher, one of the most influential philosophers of all time, I think. And they're mostly the reason why I'm reading Schopenhauer is because I'm trying to get into Nietzsche, and I know that Nietzsche was heavily influenced by Schopenhauer as well as by Dostoevsky. So I feel like I'm kind of intellectually building towards reading Nietzsche in a way that I can understand his perspectives and points of view in a more full way. Schopenhauer was highly influenced by Kant, and he is probably more popular for his brand of philosophical pessimism or something, to the degree that he was a very strong, believer that life in itself was a negative, value, and life is filled with suffering. He's one of the first philosophers who really combined his, German metaphysics and all this stuff with the East. He was getting Buddhist texts. That he was influenced by the Upanishads, for example, the Hindu sacred texts. So Arthur Schopenhauer, it's a fascinating book. He's someone who his life was kind of miserable growing up, and he eventually had a job or something that he didn't like, and he was doing out of respect to his father, who had just passed away, who kind of pushed him towards this kind of career path. And in midst of this 9 to 5, like, not necessarily 9 to 5, I'm not sure if that's how it was back then, but he was essentially very disillusioned by his work life. And when he was he was like 17 or something, and then that kind of set the stage for his like descent into, he wanted studying philosophy. He ended up leaving the job and going back to school and studying philosophy, where he got introduced to Kant and was very influenced by him. And he would write these texts, and he would write these. So his first one, I think, is The World as Will or something like that. I forgot what it's called. But he writes this first text with The World as Will and Representation, but no one reads it for like 20 years, 25 years, and Schopenhauer, his writings only become quite popular in the 1850s, and he dies in 1860, so it's like the last 10 years of his life is when he finally got some recognition. But he was a very confident man. He felt that he would get recognition at some point, but it took a while for him to get into his level of fame. And by the time that he got famous, this book is like it's written towards the end of his life, and this is not really a book. It's sections of this other book that I'm not gonna pretend like I can pronounce or whatever, but it's this other book. And the editor of this book and the translator is R.J. Hollingdale. He gets excerpts from the book because the book is not really a book, but it's a collection of writings by Schopenhauer towards the end of his life, and there's a lot of it is not very structured very well, or a lot of it is repetitive and tedious, so he kind of compiles it and to a shorter volume of texts that are representative of Schopenhauer's views towards the end of his life, in a very similar way, I guess, to Letters from a Stoic, which I read quite recently as well, that was mostly a compilation. It was like a condensed version of the full letters of Seneca to Lucilius. So yeah, those are the 3 books I'm reading right now. I'm reading Schopenhauer, Burroughs, and Jung. Very different kinds of people, very different ways of thinking, but I'm very fascinated with it. And at some point, I have to lead up to. I think I'm gonna read Zarathustra first. Although I know that that's not necessarily one of his more philosophical texts; it's more literary. But I do want to read Das Book Zarathustra because I thought the ideas of the Übermensch seems like it's quite related to that of Dostoevsky's thoughts in Crime and Punishment. But yeah, there's also Goethe, which I have, because, Nietzsche was also a big fan of Goethe. So was Schopenhauer. Goethe is a German writer. This is a play, I think, called It's Faust. I have never read it. I've heard lots of things about it, but I want to see it as well. I want to read it as well. But yeah, these are things I'm reading right now, and these are new things. I have to really catch up and finish my old books, but I can't. Probably going to finish. The next thing I'm probably going to finish would be probably the Jung book, and then maybe Junkie, and then Schopenhauer. But that's what I'm doing right now.